Now, attachment itself refers to how somebody experiences important relationships in their lives. It starts with the experience of the infant, of ourselves in infancy, in connection, in relationship with our caregivers. Particularly, there's a primary caregiver. Usually it's the mother, but certainly it could be the father. It could be any consistent caregiver or person, adult, who takes on the responsibility of being present and caring for the child. So the attachment experience psychologically and emotionally has to do with how that infant experiences that very important relationship. If secure attachment develops, or if that infant experiences the caregiver in a secure way, what that means is that experientially there will be a sense of confidence about the safe and reliable availability of that caregiver. Mary Ainsworth, who is what I consider the mother of the attachment field, John Bowlby was the father of attachment field. Mary Ainsworth, John Bowlby himself said Mary Ainsworth didn't get enough credit within the field for her contribution. So I like to highlight that, the two of them, the mother and the father, each had really essential contributions. So Mary Ainsworth highlighted that she described attachment security as the state of being untroubled about the availability of the attachment figure. And I love that sense, the state of being untroubled about the availability of the attachment figure. The sense that when I need him or her to be there, they'll be there for me. And I won't always need them to be there, but when some need comes up, when some discomfort comes up, or when I just want to be in connection with them, they'll be there. Okay? So the state of being untroubled about that. If we apply that to other important relationships in our lives, so moving from infancy to adulthood, obviously a close romantic connection, a partnered relationship, is also a very important relationship. So how we experience that relationship has direct parallels to how we experienced the early relationship with our caregiver or caregivers. So ideally, a secure adult relationship, partnered relationship, is a relationship in which we feel untroubled about the availability of that partner, that we can count on that partner being present for us in certain ways. Obviously, there are many relationships where there is the feeling of being troubled about the availability of the attachment figure. We'll talk about that as well. But insecure attachment essentially is where the child or the adult does not feel that there is a consistent and safe and reliable connection with the important other. So again, being troubled about the availability of the attachment figure is how we would define attachment insecurity. So that's an overview about that.
Yeah. So from here, I'm kind of curious if we could unpack the different attachment styles or patterns, and like you have the secure attachment, which you've already spoke about, and then what are the different patterns that insecure attachment manifest in?
Sure.
If you could describe them a little bit, yeah.
Sure. So again, starting with a bigger context, it's estimated that in Western culture, let's just take the United States, to where we both are at the moment. It's estimated that up to 50% of adults have some form of insecure attachment. Okay, some estimates are 60% secure, 40% insecure of adults, but more recent estimates suggest that maybe it's even like 50% secure and 50% insecure. And even with those who are secure, it's recognized that when there's relational stress, maybe up to 90 or 95% of people, even secure people, will show some of the insecure patterns. Okay? So this takes us to your question about insecurity. Depending on the particular developmental experiences that a child has, he or she will have a sense of security, which I've defined, or one of several forms of insecurity. Now, insecurity reflects a defensive adaptation to the sense of being troubled about the availability of the attachment figure. Okay? I think this is a very important point because it moves away from pathologizing the insecure patterns. They can be problematic. They can create difficulty for the person individually and in relationship, but they're actually attempts to adapt to uncomfortable experiences that happened very early in life. And those adaptations, for various reasons, will continue unless they're addressed and resolved at some point beyond childhood. They will tend to continue later into life, into adolescence, young adulthood, and adulthood. And again, they're attempts to try to cope with the difficult experiences. So one of the prominent, there's various ways to sort of carve up any pie. Okay, so we take a natural phenomenon and we apply the ways that our human minds work. And in order to understand better, we tend to categorize. We tend to break the natural phenomena up into various subcategories so that we can understand them better, we can research them, we can talk about them. I highlight this because I think it's important to recognize the limitations of what our minds do to any phenomenon, that it's useful, but it's what our minds are doing to the phenomenon. One of the ways this manifests in the field of attachment is that there are various ways to carve up the attachment subtype pie. And one of the most common way is to say that there are 4 categories of attachment: secure, and then 3 subcategories of insecure: dismissing or avoidant, anxious preoccupied, and also disorganized. In the literature and the research pertaining to children, these were initially described as avoidant, anxious ambivalent, and disorganized or disoriented.
Yes, the anxious ambivalent one also preoccupied sometimes. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah, there's different terms within the field for the child forms and for the adult forms. So the ambivalent or anxious ambivalent is in the adult category, and the way we describe it, anxious preoccupied. So as we continue talking, I'll use avoidant or dismissing, anxious preoccupied, and disorganized. So that's the 4 primary categories. There are other models that have looked with more specificity at the various subtypes. So Patricia Crittenden, who's a brilliant researcher, contemporary researcher in the field of attachment, she has a model where during adulthood there are 23 potential subcategories of the attachment types, and they can be reliably identified and fruitfully so. We can understand with more granularity and more specificity some of the particularities. From 4 to 23, we might say there are as many subtypes of attachment as there are human beings, because everybody's different. And that's a very important perspective for a therapist to take when someone comes into the therapy room or on the therapy Zoom screen. That even though there are particular patterns that appear, everybody's different, and we want to meet that particular person where that person is. All right, so that's a big context, which you're learning. I'm big on setting context before talking about particulars. Back to your question. So anxious or dismissing or avoidant. When a child experiences, so the biological way of looking at attachment, which John Bowlby was particularly interested in, and then the early field of attachment, starting in the 30s and the 40s, it was recognized that we are biologically encoded to seek connection with our attachment figure. Okay, why might that have developed evolutionarily? Well, to support our survival. Okay, an animal, say a deer out in the wild, who is more prone to orient towards staying close with the mother or with the herd, is more likely to survive against the threat of predators. Okay? Humans who, unlike deer, are not able to walk within minutes after birth, are so dependent on the caregivers for a very long time that there's also encoded within us ways that we try to orient toward the caregiver. We can't go to the caregiver, but we try to capture the caregiver's attention so he or she will come to us. We smile. Okay, the smile within the first days of an infant after birth, for most caregivers, will capture the attention. That'll feel good, and the caregiver will give attention to that child. A very different kind of attachment connecting behavior would be crying. Captures the attention of the caregiver. It's probably aversive rather than appealing, but it still captures the attention of the caregiver, and hopefully the caregiver will then come to the infant and provide what's needed to soothe or comfort the child. If over time this kind of dance of seeking connection and establishing connection, the caregiver also feeling connected to the infant and wanting contact with the infant, where both have this sort of satisfying interpersonal dynamic. If that occurs really, really well, or actually in a good enough way, then the security will develop. But if, when the infant is seeking connection, when the young child is seeking connection with the caregiver actually, more often than not, or in some significantly uncomfortable ways, is rejecting of that child's entreaties for contact, for connection, for soothing, for care, the child will come to learn that seeking contact is aversive. Seeking contact is likely to lead to some uncomfortable experience, and we'll need to adapt to that. Okay, over time, of course, it's built into us. It's encoded in us biologically, evolutionarily, to seek contact, to orient toward the caregiver. This is called proximity seeking, closeness, connection seeking. But if the infant and young child has enough experience that every time proximity was sought, some sort of uncomfortable experience was created, the child will adapt to that by shutting down that proximity seeking, by not orienting toward the caregiver, by figuring out how to solve the problems himself or herself. Okay? The child will become what Mary Ainsworth initially referred to as avoidant, will avoid contact because contact becomes threatening. The child learns, again, to be on one's own. The caregiver will tend to, the avoidant caregiver, somebody who behaves in these rejecting ways, perhaps because he or she experiences as a child, will, because he or she also doesn't want contact so much with the child, will be supportive of the child being on his or her own, figuring things out, playing on his own, exploring on his or her own. Okay? this gets cultivated, this gets internalized by the young child and becomes an expectation about relationships, becomes an expectation about close relationships. So if I had discomfort when I sought and experienced closeness with my caregiver, that gets encoded in me. It's a learned experience. There's an internal representation of attachment relationship that gets established. It's an internal working model that acts as a predictor about what will happen in future relationships. So that when I start feeling close with somebody in my adult life, if I have this avoidant memory, this internal working model, this set of experiences that got laid down not only in my cognitive memory, but even more importantly, in my body memory. I felt uncomfortable. I felt tense. I felt hurt when I was close with somebody early on. When I start to feel close with somebody now, that will get activated and I'll get afraid. And what will I do in response to that? I'll pull back. I'll avoid. Or I will maintain some optimal distance from the other by perhaps dismissing. I might be critical of my partner. What's the effect? What's the constructive effect of being critical? The partner will move away some. And then I will have that distance so I won't have to feel so scared about the closeness. So the dismissing avoidant pattern tends to emerge in this particular way. And then the anxious preoccupied pattern tends to occur when the child, more often than not, I'm saying child and infant here. Let me highlight that the critical period for the development of the attachment representations that I was just describing, the internal working models, is the first 2 years of life. Okay? So this is very early relational experience, and it has to do with the developmental dynamics cognitively and relationally during those first 2 years. There's a whole lot going on during that period. And so if during those first 2 years of life, the child who's wanting contact, who's wanting safe, stable, reliable contact with the caregiver, primary caregiver, experiences that caregiver as unreliably available, say intermittently available, sometimes there, but sometimes not there, say more often than not, distracted, maybe because the caregiver himself or herself is anxious, maybe anxious preoccupied. Then there's a lot of self-absorption, a lot of self-involvement, a lot of sort of anxious states that interfere with the ability of that caregiver to be present to the child, to be present and attuned. The child needs to learn ways to, again, try to get the caregiver to be attentive in some way, and to stave off the fear that the caregiver will be unavailable. Because if the caregiver is unavailable during certain critical early experiences, certain uncomfortable, problematic states, then the child will get really afraid. That sense of being alone can lead to, almost annihilation fears at such an early age. So what the child tends to do is get preoccupied. The child will feel some anxiety and get preoccupied with the relationship with the caregiver to try to make him or her be available. This is actually a foundation for the common pattern that we know about as codependence, the tendency to focus more on the other's needs in relationship than on our own needs. So the child learns to become very involved with the caregiver to try to soothe the caregiver, calmed, so then the caregiver might be more available to the child and to provide what's needed. This is particularly relevant now for parents in our current culture around distractibility. As we know, there's a lot written about social media and smartphones and the tendency for people to have limited attention spans. And of course, I'm sure all of us can bring to mind experiences of either in ourselves or witnessing people around carrying a young child, an infant, and being more involved with the phone than with the infant. Okay, so I think there's a tendency toward greater likelihood of this anxious, preoccupied pattern to appear because of this kind of societal trend and phenomenon that's occurring now. Now, a third insecure subtype within this particular categorization framework is the disorganized type. And again, if we think about the patterns as adaptations, where the infant tries to cope with the distressing experiences of problematically available or inconsistently available or rejectingly available caregiver, the disorganized pattern initially, Mary Main, who was a graduate student of Mary Ainsworth, and working together with Mary Ainsworth, they described this fourth category as can't classify. It was a subgroup of infants in their research who didn't show either the avoidant or the ambivalent pattern. So when they were thinking of these just three subcategories, secure and two of insecure, they said, well, here's a group we can't classify because they showed behaviors that were sometimes avoidant, sometimes ambivalent. Well, in some relational developmental circumstances, it would be adaptive for a child to sometimes show the avoidant pattern and sometimes show the ambivalent pattern. Perhaps one of the parents in a two-parent family was of the more avoidant type and more rejecting, and so the child would need to adapt to that when with that caregiver. And perhaps the other parent was more anxious, preoccupied, and the child would need to learn adaptive strategies for that particular experience as well. So in adult life, then there's a mix or a combination of these defensive strategies that would appear. And so this is often referred to now within the field as the disorganized form because it's not organized into one of the two primary insecure subtypes. But a lot of people, especially Pat Crittenden, who I referred to earlier, and I'm aligned with this way of thinking too, disorganized doesn't do justice to the adaptive brilliance that children that we have as organisms, and one way to look at the so-called disorganized pattern is that there is organization within it. It's just a combination of the adaptive strategies that appear. Now, one way that the term disorganized does apply to this other category sometimes, or to some people that get identified within this insecure category, is that among the developmental circumstances that can create this insecure subtype is the experience of being really frightened by the caregiver. The caregiver may have disorganized states himself or herself, may be dissociative because of unresolved trauma, may have very poor emotion regulation because of early insecure experiences and developmental factors. And so the child does not feel the sense of the caregiver as safe and stable, and that can be very frightening for the child. And when the fears come up in that context, if the caregiver is disorganized or has unresolved traumas that can easily get triggered, the caregiver is likely not to be available to help soothe the infant and to reassure the infant. And so states that are very unpleasant that don't get resolved. Is a term that's used within the field, fear without solution. Okay? And if you think about the developing organism and the developing nervous system of an infant, if fear states get prominent and don't get resolved in a good enough way, that's going to affect the development of the nervous system in ways that will set into the nervous system the tendency to get overwhelmed, the tendency to not have good emotion regulation. And so as an adult, then those negative problematic states will become prominent and will look disorganized, okay, and create real problems personally and interpersonally for that person. Let me say one more thing about the developmental dynamics. Research has highlighted that infants with secure attachment by 2 years of age show more rapid development, more rapid brain development, more rapid and earlier developmental milestones being reached, cognitive developmental milestones being reached. Children with insecure attachment as a group will tend to show slower developmental progress. The brains don't develop as rapidly. There are 3 categories psychologically that I'd like to highlight as particularly important for the field of psychotherapy. Insecure attachment will tend to, well, let's frame it positively first. Secure attachment will support self-development. Okay? Self-development means the development of self-boundaries, self-identity, self-esteem, stability in the face of stress. Okay? Insecure attachment, self-development is impaired in various ways to varying degrees, depending on the patterns and the particular experiences. Also, relational development is supported by secure attachment. Secure attachment is fundamentally established by a healthy dynamic relationship between the infant and the caregiver. That healthy dynamic relationship gets internalized and creates skills within the infant for relational dynamics later in childhood and all into life beyond. So when there are problematic relational dynamics, those get internalized and the child will show relational problems later in childhood and onward into adulthood as well. When there's secure attachment, there is a greater tendency to develop emotion regulation skills, the ability to effectively respond to emotional distress when it comes up. As human beings within the world, or as just, let's say, as living organisms within the complex and challenging world, we experience threat, we experience various emotional turmoil forms. Ideally, we have a full range of capacity for emotional experience that supports the richness of life. And also, ideally, we develop the capacity to regulate those emotions, to not get overwhelmed, disoriented, overly disturbed by those emotions. Okay? Emotion regulation is also fundamentally developed through a healthy dynamic relationship between caregiver and infant. When the caregiver is attuned to the child and recognizes that the child is emotionally upset and is able to be attentive and effectively responsive to that upset and provide soothing and comforting for that child, the child has the experience of having an upset, being recognized, and being soothed and comforted. And if that happens over and over and over again, to a good enough degree, that child internalizes the ability to be soothed. The child internalizes the experience of the caregiver being soothing So that now later in my life, when I get upset, if I'm secure, then I have an internal working model of that's effective at emotion regulation and self-soothing. When the caregivers aren't effectively soothing consistently enough, the child doesn't develop these internalized emotion regulation abilities and will have more emotional difficulties with perhaps overwhelm and dysregulation later in life. So security supports self-development, relational development, and emotion regulation development as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for unpacking that and formulating that in such a beautiful and concise way. And I just hope that the listeners are catching how important attachment really is in so many ways, starting from the development of the child, where insecure attachment leads to delays in their ability to reach certain developmental milestones, and then transferring over to their relationships in adulthood and in their ability to regulate emotions. So it's just fascinating the impact that it can have on a person's life.